Our guest today is a very difficult person to sort of characterize, in part because he's worn so many hats and he's done them all very, very well. You probably have talked a lot about the notion of pivoting during a career and being good at everything you do. And I think today's guest, Boris Jordan, has shown that. He's got a very unusual background simply because of the number of things that he's done over time. He's been a banker at First Boston in Moscow. He's been the man who was heavily responsible for the privatization of many, many state-owned enterprises in Russia. He has also been one of the key leaders who was responsible for the sort of growth of the modern stock market in Russia. He also is, co-founder of Renaissance Capital. He's the head of Renaissance Insurance, which is a major insurer in Russia. And he is also the sort of executive chairman of Curaleaf, which is the largest cannabis company in the U.S. And he's also become a voice for the industry and a person, sort of the go-to person that people turn to when they want to know what's going on in that business, what about the prospects of that business, and what are some of the stumbles ahead. And so I'm really happy to have him here today for all of that, but also because he's extremely articulate in talking about what's facing the industries that he participates in, and he's just a very good interview. So, Mr. Jordan, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Jim. What a
okay.
Nobody's ever given me an introduction like that, so I appreciate it.
That could either be good or bad. I'll take it as good, though. Well, I want to start with sort of a scene setter. I understand that, maybe 5 years ago, looking at where cannabis is today would have seemed like a stretch. But right now, it is a vibrant, really exciting, fast-growing industry that has won surprisingly widespread acceptance over the last 5 years. When you look at where the business is now than when you first decided to invest in it back in 2014, are you surprised at how far we've come?
Jim, actually, it's very interesting that you start with that because it's maybe the only issue in the United States today that has bipartisan support, if you can believe it. And that, look, almost every ballot initiative that's happened in every state around the country, the cannabis legislation is passed with an overwhelming majority of both Republicans and Democrats. Today, it polls at over 93% for medical cannabis and 76% for adult use recreational cannabis. So it's something that the country is very much united on, but still it's certainly a industry which still causes a lot of distress and I would say debate and anxiety in Washington, D.C.
Now, were you, when you first became involved in investing in this business, it wasn't the same environment. Were you, were you just, convinced that it was a time had come for cannabis?
Yeah, I think, Jim, what I did was I looked around and I saw that cannabis, did some research, and I saw that cannabis has been used by people for over 1,000 years. They found cannabis in Egyptian tombs. We know it was used by American Indians for medical purposes. It was obviously very widely used at the turn of the last century, early 1900s in the U.S. until it was made illegal. And then, of course, we all remember probably the 1960s and 70s when cannabis was very widely used. And so I knew that there was natural pent-up demand. According to U.S. statistics, U.S. government DEA statistics, the illicit market in the United States was over $100 billion. And so I realized that as these states would legalize, that our job, what we were doing, is we were taking customers that were using cannabis and buying it illegally, probably in many cases unsafe product, and we were going to move them from that market to the legal market where product is tested and regulated and is legal to be used. And so I believed in the fact that people would rather buy something legal than illegal and safer rather than unsafe. And to be honest, that thesis has proven been correctly because the growth has been astronomical in the sector across the board.
Now, the growth has been astronomical, but there have been plenty of hurdles from sort of a government and regulatory side. I mean, one of the things that's really marked this business is the fact that it has succeeded despite a lot of obstacles from regulators and state governments and federal law. I mean, one of the problems with sort of legitimizing and sort of bringing it on what had been a controlled substance for a long, long time is that a lot of the laws don't allow for the typical business practices, things like being able to go out and get a bank loan, things like be able to sort of do adequate credit, do financing. Now, a lot of that still work still needs to be done right, and is the change in administration in Washington going to make that an easier pull?
So, Jim, it's incredible how difficult it is to operate in this sector. Not only everything you mentioned, you can't get a bank loan, young people that are working in the sector, operating on grow facilities or in laboratories are having their bank accounts closed. People making, $50,000 a year are having their Chase Manhattan or Citibank's accounts closed because they're working in cannabis. This is the largest job creator in the United States at the moment. And we pay an effective tax rate of 55%. We are classified as more dangerous than cocaine under U.S. Regulatory rules at the FDA and the DEA. So it's incredible that cannabis is still in that category at the federal level, but yet at the state levels, they're approving it. They're allowing more and more innovation in products we're building, and the industry's turning profitable, even in a situation where both hands are tied behind our back. There's lots of we can't trade on U.S. exchanges, and Canadian cannabis companies, Jim, can trade on U.S. exchanges, and U.S. cannabis companies, the ones that actually hire U.S. employees that create jobs in the United States, invest in the United States, cannot trade on U.S. exchanges. It's an absolute travesty. I've never seen anything like this happen in the United States before, where our own businesses are discriminated against other foreign companies. Colombian companies can trade in the U.S. European companies can trade in the U.S. Canadian companies doing cannabis can trade in the U.S. But U.S. companies that operate in our market cannot trade in the U.S. and cannot raise capital on U.S. exchanges from U.S. investors for our industry. So it's a very difficult industry to operate. But despite all of that, the customers are coming faster and faster in more quantities, and our companies continuing to build out across the board, and the industry continues to develop in spite of all of those restrictions put onto us by the federal government today.
Given that there's a lot of preference by consumers for this to become legal and this to become an established product category, do you think that that's going to help push along some legislation in Congress? I mean, right now, the SAFE Act that would allow, at least a more level playing field when it comes to, banking and financing for this industry.
Yes, I think there's certainly pressure on Congress now to start moving legislation. At the moment, the House of Representatives has now passed safe banking 3 times and passed the MORE Act, which is the more broader legalization once. The problem has been historically in the Senate and the administration. Under McConnell, he would not allow any cannabis legislation to get to even committee. So he halted it back. Now that we have a democratically controlled Senate, certainly Senator Schumer has been playing lip service to the fact that he wants to pass comprehensive cannabis legislation and is working on some legislation. But he has stalled the safe banking legislation because he says it doesn't go far enough. What he wants to do is he wants to do something more comprehensive. Now, although on the one hand, we support what he is doing, on the other hand, we could use any help at the moment from the federal government to at least lift some of the tax burden and some of the restrictions to bring the cost of capital down. One of the big issues facing this industry is the issue of social justice, the inequities, which obviously were there for minority communities that were hurt very badly by the war on drugs. We are 100% supportive by these initiatives, but you can't help those communities and you can't help finance these groups if your cost of capital is 15% and if you have to pay a tax rate of 55%. And so the first step, in our opinion, is you've got to get this banking legislation through, and you can also pass comprehensive, but my worry is I worry that they don't have the votes from the Republicans to pass the more comprehensive legislation. And so let's see my vote. I believe in Schumer. I think he's He knows obviously the Senate better than I do. He knows what he can do, he can't do. He's put his reputation on the line by saying he's going to get this done. We're all anticipating. I can tell you the community is behind him on trying to get this legislation passed.
Now, we've gotten, because there is, sort of no federal law that allows this industry to operate across states, we've ended up with a lot of different state regulations and problems that a lot of businesses don't have, which is the ability to, sort of trade, or do trade in one state, but not be able to cross borders, not be able to transport, product across the state lines. Now, that's caused this sort of craziness about how do you, build a national business? How do you build an integral business when you've got to basically do market by market? That's a very large challenge, right, for the growth of this industry?
Yes, the cost, for instance, if you look at Europe today, which is a few years behind us in the United States, they do allow you, for instance, to manufacture and grow in Portugal and then sell to Germany, England, other countries within Europe. In the United States, we're not allowed to. We have to be fully vertical in each state. So in other words, we have to grow in that state, we have to manufacture in that state, we have to sell and distribute in that state, and we cannot cross lines. We can't even move money across state lines. That would be illegal under federal law today. So there is an enormous amount of impediments for this industry in the current structure today. And obviously this industry will be much more efficient than it is today once those impediments go away. The only other industry in the United States that I know that operates under a similar, except that it is allowed to raise money in the U.S. and allowed to use banks, is gambling. The gambling industry in the United States is not federal. You're not allowed to move across state lines with gambling. You're only allowed to do it in the specific states, and you're only allowed to have licenses from those states. And so that's why there was an initiative years ago to form something called the States Act and pass it through Congress, which would allow the federal government, in effect, would say, you states can determine your own rules and regulations for cannabis. However, we will allow banking and banking services for employees and customers and supply chain, all these things to be allowed, as well as listing. But that didn't go forward at this point in time. And so the industry continues to develop. We continue to build. We're working with Washington as much as we can. At least in my case, me and Curaleaf, who are the leaders in the industry, are leading the way in Washington to try to see if we can get comprehensive legislation passed. But for the time being, we're still waiting for that law to be issued or to be drafted and submitted to the Senate by Senator Schumer, Senator Wyden, and Senator Booker. We're all waiting for it in great anticipation. And it's not only the companies that are waiting for it, it's the consumers that are waiting for it because prices will come down. It's the disenfranchised communities that are waiting for it because then they can get involved in the business. So everyone is waiting for some sort of legislation in this area because 80% of the U.S. population today, Jim, has access to one form or another of cannabis, whether it be medical or whether it be adult use. And the federal government is way behind the population on this issue.
Now, you mentioned, that things are happening here, but they're also happening overseas. I know that, that is, for most businesses, something that they've done after they developed the sort of a national business here. This is unusual simply because of all the impediments here. I know you've been taking action to expand Curaleaf's, footprint outside the U.S. I mean, so why is that, and what are you doing?
Well, Curaleaf today is the largest operator globally, not only in the United States, but also in Europe now, by revenue, by market cap, by all categories in the cannabis world. And obviously, we're developing our brands and our technologies here, but for instance, Europe is actually a market that potentially is twice the size of the United States, given the size of the European Union and the size of the European economy. And it's also a community that uses cannabis. The estimates of the illicit market there are over $200 billion. If you take on some of the countries around Europe, for instance, Israel, Eastern Europe, Ukraine, other countries that are moving in the direction of legalization now. So Curaleaf decided that it wanted to have a foothold in the European markets. And so we made an acquisition there. We bought the largest European vertically integrated company a couple of months back, and we're now starting to move our brands and some of our technologies to Europe. But also, the European market is much more deep on the medical research. For instance, only today, the DEA came out and said they're going to start granting research licenses in the United States after many, many years of holding it back. They said they're finally going to start granting research licenses. Well, in Europe, they've been granting those licenses for 10 years. And Curaleaf, through this acquisitions, now has access to a lot of the research and development that's been done in Europe on working with the cannabis plant and the various cannabinoids on the various medicinal properties that these plants have. And so that was also an IP acquisition for Curaleaf.
Now, you have a very large medical marijuana business. I am curious, long term, do you see the company sort of trying to strike some sort of a balance, or is there a preferred mix between medical and long-term adult use?
Yeah, I think there's going to be three categories as far as the medical, as far as the plant is concerned. I think there will be the high-grade pharmaceutical, the medical side of it, which will largely be synthetic forms of cannabis as they're developed. I think then there'll be the nutraceutical products, like what Curaleaf does today. And then there'll be the adult use. So Curaleaf is really focusing on today the wellness and nutraceutical side under Curaleaf's brand, and the adult use side under our Select brand. The medical side, which I think will be largely dominated by the pharma companies, will really be driven by synthetic cannabis, because they need a very stable supply chain. It's difficult to work with biologicals, even though a lot of European and Asian countries are moving in the direction of moving away from synthetics into biological medicines. The United States, for the most part today, is very much still a synthetic medical market. And so it is more likely that the US cannabis market will develop along synthetic lines. Now, we are looking at that part of the market, but there still hasn't been enough money invested in the development of synthetics to be actually able to create a supply chain so we could formulate the medicines required. So today we work with the biological form of the plant, and we do formulate the medicines using the plant at the time. But that, as we all know, is not as perfect as having a synthetic supply chain.
Now, nutraceuticals, do you think that how big a future is there for cannabis as, let's say, an ingredient in millions of like beverages, things that people often might not think of as a use for that?
So if you think about it today, and we just addressed for a second just the U.S. market, I'm not talking about the whole world. The traditional cannabis market in the U.S., the traditional user is about $100 billion. But that's not even talking about all the new users that are coming in. So, for instance, the pandemic was an enormous boost to the cannabis industry, because a lot of people, particularly elderly, started to use cannabis for sleep, for anxiety, and other things. For instance, my 80-year-old in-laws started to use, they were having problems sleeping during the pandemic. They're both over 80 years old, and they got a medical card in New York, and they started using different products to help them sleep. And they've said that those have been incredibly useful for them. And we're seeing a new customer starting to come in. We're seeing a lot of women coming in using cannabis products, drinks products, to substitute alcohol from a calorie perspective. And as many people know, cannabis seems to be healthier then. It's interesting, tax revenues in Illinois, in Colorado, and other states that have recently gone adult use, alcohol sales are down substantially, cannabis sales are up, and tax revenues from cannabis sales are higher than they are from alcohol sales. And this is a tendency, and that's why you've seen the big alcohol companies embrace cannabis and start to lobby for the legalization of cannabis, because they're seeing it as a disruptive threat to the alcohol business in the United States.
When you're relegated to operating within states that allow cannabis sales, whether they're medical, whether they're adult use, how difficult is it to actually develop, sort of a branded strategy? I say that because I know that, your brand has been very successful. I'm just wondering, is that as large a challenge as I think it is?
Yes, it's very difficult, because the reason Curaleaf went so wide as quickly as we did, we operate in 23 states and 8 countries in Europe right now, was because I realized that you cannot build a national brand unless you have a national footprint. And so Curaleaf today, it's hard to imagine we're going to sell, $1.3 billion of cannabis products in the United States alone this year. And that's before any acquisitions that we're going to do. So it's an industry, and that is double from what we did last year of, call it $650 million of revenues last year. And so you need a national footprint to be able to build these brands, but it's very difficult. So for instance, a national launch of a brand, in every state there are different packaging rules, what you can put on packaging, how you have to disclose it, what you have to disclose. And so it's very hard and very inefficient to launch a national product when in every state your packaging may have to be different. And that's why we need federal law and federal regulation for these products, so it would be more efficient for us to be able to distribute. But you know what? We are still operating within what we have today. The companies are growing. Yes, it's more difficult, but it just shows you that even with all of these restrictions on the sector, the consumer wants this product, and the sector, because of that, is supplying these products, and the sector is growing at over 100% annual growth rates.
Now, investors have, sort of been excited about cannabis companies at times. They've been sort of worried about prospects of cannabis companies at times. After the election, they were excited again. And you see this sort of waxing and waning. I mean, what do you think that, what do you think they're looking at now? Particularly, I mean, are they sort of waiting to hear what happens from the Biden administration, or is there some other shoe that investors might be waiting on in the sector?
Well, I think the first thing you need to do is the biggest issue right now facing the investment community is understanding the difference between the Canadian companies that trade in the U.S. and the U.S. companies that trade in Canada. So the Canadian companies that trade in the U.S. are largely small businesses with significant losses because they operate in a market that's the size of one of our states in the United States. The U.S. companies, what they're called is the MSOs, the multi-state operators, of which Curaleaf is the largest, they trade in Canada today. And there's the Canadian exchange we trade on. It's a very small exchange. We don't even trade on the TSX. We trade on something called the CSE. It's called the Canadian Stock Exchange. It's not even their NASDAQ. It's a very small regional exchange where all the U.S. companies tend to trade. But these are companies with significant market caps. You're talking $5-10 billion market caps today. But the investors today, what they really need is they need safe harbor legislation. So if you want large investors in this country, they need safe harbor legislation. So one, they can make the investment. Two, the big custodians, whether it be JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Bank of New York, can actually custody the stock. The biggest impediment today is the fact that they can't even custody these shares in their banks because the federal government has no legislation. The federal government hasn't had any enforcement actions against anyone, but you know as well as I do, after 2008 and the mortgage crisis and all the fines the banks paid there, they don't want to breach any rules. So they're living by the strict rule. There is no legislation around cannabis, so we can't custody these products. But the federal government hasn't given them any guidance. And so we're hoping under the Biden administration soon, we'll either get legislation or at least some guidance from the Department of Justice and the Treasury about how the banks can treat the sector. And hopefully we get some good news on that within the next several months.
Now, from your early days working in what was essentially an emerging market in Russia to this emerging industry, I mean, do you like to take the sort of, let's just say, the more difficult path, going at a business that isn't established and sort of finding your way there, as opposed to, sort of doing something where all the rules are already laid out?
Well, when I went to Russia, I was a young kid, and I just got out of university. I went to NYU, and then I worked at Kidder Peabody for a few years, and then I went off to Europe and Russia to tackle that emerging market. So I didn't really do much thinking back then about what I was doing. But one thing I learned in that market was that if you have high barriers to entry and you have scalable opportunities like Russia was at that time, and the barriers to entry was that nobody knew anything about it. It was a new emerging market, but it had all these natural resources, and obviously it was going to be a winner, that it was an interesting market to investors. So I worked with people like George Soros and got to know him personally, with Julian Robertson, some of the biggest, and Leon Cooper, some of the biggest names in the investment world back then. And they taught me how to look at these markets. And so when I came back to the United States and I saw the opportunity in cannabis, there was this enormously large scalable market with higher barriers to entry given all the regulations. And so I thought, and one that had large demand in an existing market. And so it met all of my boxes, it checked all the boxes, and I went into it all in.
So when you look ahead now, let's say we're 5 years from now, where would you like the cannabis industry to be?
I would hope that in 5 years, the cannabis industry is mainstream, operating like any other CPG or pharmaceutical business. So, as I said, I think it will split up, working, with safe products regulated by the FDA, where it's capital efficient. It's not treated as some kind of bad schoolboy with the cone on his head in the corner of the classroom. That's what we're hoping for. We'll see whether it gets there. There's still a lot of people in Washington that look a little bit like me, gray-haired and balding, that are skeptical because they spent their life on the war on drugs. Cannabis should never have been part of that war on drugs. It is a healthier product than alcohol, and it is much more medicinal, obviously. And so it doesn't have any of the addiction side effects or the things that you get from some of the, I mean, today we promoted in the United States opiates. We pushed opiates on our population, and we made cannabis illegal. And the two are completely uncomparable. So, cannabis is a healing plant. It helps so many people with different conditions, particularly children with epilepsy or people with chronic pain. Whereas these other drugs hooked people up. It created a big, giant cottage industry, whereas cannabis doesn't fall into that category. So I'm really hopeful that that's going to change, and the perception of the plant will change in the United States.